My name is Anita Viberg. I'm the CEO of Seva Exchange Corporation. Seva means volunteer in Sanskrit. And our chairman is Edgar Kahn. He invented the concept of time banking. And time banking is where you give an hour of time, you get a time credit, and you can redeem that for an hour of time that you need. So you volunteer at a nonprofit, and now you can get an hour of someone mowing your lawn or reorganizing your garage. Who wants to do those things? No one, right? Well, there actually are people like that. So what we're doing is we're using technology to do skills matching to needs. So using AI, because trust me, you may not like doing something, but there'll be somebody out there that does, right? And wouldn't it be great to, spend more time doing your passions, for free and helping others and getting things you need for yourself? And those people who say, oh, well, I just volunteer for the sake of volunteering, well, then donate those credits to someone else in need, right? So you're doubling your volunteering impact. So this is why it was so exciting when I read this, and I'm like, are you my twin? What the hell, man? I've been planning this too. So
yeah, that's true.
I'm not supporting him just because of that, but I mean that was after the fact. So I was just really excited. So there's more of these books you can get. Okay, Jeremy Strike. I met him at a blockchain event, and I thought he was remarkable that he was interviewing so many people. He has his own podcast, but he just from asking a couple questions, he was so amazing with your interview skills. So I invited him to help us.
I feel like I'm
And I don't know, do I need to introduce you? Andrew Yang, thank you all.
So Andrew, before we get started, a mutual friend of ours told me a story, and I want to clear it up.
Oh wow,
with you.
this will be so fun.
So you were a lawyer for a couple of months, right?
Yeah, 5 months.
So what was the relationship between your law time and Dungeons and Dragons?
Yes. So I went home to my parents after a few months as a lawyer and said I didn't dream about becoming a scribe when I was a kid. I dreamt about going into the woods and killing something.
Mm-hmm. And now you're going to be the dungeon master.
Well, now I have to go kill the dragon. Unfortunately, the dragon is alive and well.
Mm-hmm. Very unfortunate.
So I just want to say first, thank you to Anita and Adam for having us in their beautiful home. And the great spread. And to Raman and Ranjan for co-hosting tonight and bringing us all together.
And most of all, thank you for coming.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is the height for me, coming into a beautiful home with incredible people that are doing such good in the world and getting some of the smartest, most moral people in the country together. I mean, this is a joy. If this is what every night looked like, this campaign would be a blast.
So let's dig in. So, Andrew, you were an entrepreneur. Yeah, that's what you were born into doing. So, how does this transition from entrepreneurial spirit into politics? How does that play?
Well, I certainly wasn't born entrepreneurial necessarily, where my father was a physicist. My parents, how many went to Berkeley?
Go Bears!
Yes. My parents met at Berkeley in the 60s, and my brother's named after the Lawrence Observatory. We used to joke that he was conceived there, but I'm sure he wasn't, because my parents were boring Taiwanese grad students. So my father's a physicist. He has 69 U.S. patents with IBM and GE. My mom's now an artist, and I think one of my mom's high school classmates is here. Yeah.
Classmate. Go to the same school.
Same school, schoolmate. So I grew up just as a nerdy Asian kid. Certainly not like, oh, this kid's going to be an entrepreneur. I mean, I didn't have a paper route or any of that. My parents said, do well in school, get a good job. So I went to Exeter and then Brown, where I studied economics. And then I went to law school at Columbia and was an unhappy lawyer for 5 months. And at that point, then I left to start a .com. So at that point, I guess you consider me entrepreneurial. But that first company totally did not work out. It had its mini rise and maximum fall during the .com bust. And so after that, I worked at another software company, and then I became the CEO of an education company that grew to become number one in the United States and was acquired by the Washington Post in 2009. So at that point, my parents started telling people about me again. There was a long time they pretended pretended I was a lawyer for a while in there. So when I was when I was the head of this education company, I personally taught the analyst classes at McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and I saw all of these smart, ambitious young people that really did not like their jobs. And they reminded me of me at Davis Polk. And I was like, what a train wreck. Someone should really do something about that. So then when my company was acquired, I was like, well, what do I think the biggest problems of the world are? And the biggest problem at the time, I thought, was that we had so much talent doing so much stuff that was not really going to push the economy or society forward. And so then I thought, well, what would I want them to do? Because you can't just be a negative dude. You can't be like, oh, don't do that. So I thought, well, what would be the most positive thing that I could imagine these young people doing? People like Jackson, who's now a freshman at Stanford, 3 years from now, when all of his friends are going to go to Silicon Valley companies. So I thought the most wholesome, productive thing they could do would be to start and grow a business in a place like Detroit or New Orleans or Cleveland or Baltimore, places that were not one of the big 5 or 6 cities. And so I started this organization, Venture for America. I donated $120,000 to seed the organization. And then I started calling rich friends saying, do you love America? And then the savvy among them were like, what does it mean if I say yes? And then I said, at least $10,000. And then they said, I love America for $10,000. So our budget was around $250,000 in 2011. This year our budget's more than $6 million, thousands of applicants, hundreds of fellows. And there was a documentary made about us by an Oscar-winning filmmaker that's now on Netflix if you like documentaries. It's called Generation Startup. I make appearances as the magical Asian man who shows up and does good things for people. I have an IMDb credit now as myself. So that's what I've done for the last 7 years as an entrepreneur. And this is a very long-winded way of explaining how the heck I got into politics. That I created Venture for America to try and create jobs in the U.S. because I thought if you had enough jobs, then everything would be good. We've helped create about 3,000 jobs around the U.S. I got medals and awards for that. But I became convinced that we were pouring water into a bathtub that has a giant hole ripped in the bottom, where we were creating 3,000 jobs, and then we're going to lose 3 million jobs out the back. And the reason why Donald Trump won the election in 2016 is that we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, all of the swing states he needed to win. And right now we're sitting in the hub of Silicon Valley, and everyone here knows that we're about to do the same thing to workers in retail, call centers, fast food, truck driving, the most common job in 29 states. And that what led Donald Trump to become our president is just going to get deeper and more brutal very, very quickly. So imagine if your job was to create American jobs, you realize that what you're doing is not going to come anywhere near solving the problem, and then you think, okay, how would you solve the problem? And there's no realistic way you can solve the problem unless you have an engaged public sector. And so that's when it all started cascading on me, where I said, wow, someone needs to make this happen in the public sector as quickly as possible. And I now, at that point, like many of you, have been around the block enough to know that no one in the existing political system is going to do it. And so that's when I decided to run for president. So I'm certainly not someone who's like a natural politician, though, I'm getting better.
So you mentioned Donald Trump. That's a big reason why a lot of us are here. And one of the, hey, it's true. We need change, and this is the man who's going to do it. So, this is a quote that you said. I hope I don't screw it up a little. But you said Donald Trump is an emblem of the accelerating decline of American society, and I think most of us, if not all, can agree to something like that. And what's very interesting about this whole, what you're proposing is that, you see that Donald Trump, what has happened with Donald Trump, you see the improvements and the decline in these jobs being eradicated, right? And you focus on the people, right? You have built this Venture for America company, and you say it yourself, the people are what made this great. And you want to use that as president of the United States. And so how are you going to do that? How will you empower the common people to, take back control of their jobs and their livelihood?
Yeah, indeed. It's been said that the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian guy who likes numbers. and so a lot of what we're doing right now, we pretty much have to do the opposite of. and so right now, there's something of a trickle-down economy where there's certain people, including many of us in this room, and it's totally, it's reality. And that the theory is that if certain people do well, then it will somehow trickle down to others. And what we have to do is we have to build a trickle-up economy from human beings and families and communities up. And I go through some of this in my book where right now financial insecurity is sweeping most of America, where 57% of Americans can't afford an unexpected $500 bill. And many of them are experiencing like just week to week, month to month income volatility and financial insecurity. It's one reason why the work Anita is doing is so important and that I love time banking so much. And so the question is how you can reverse that. And unfortunately, most of the conventional political solutions aren't going to work at all. Like the most popular liberal solution would be something like, we can educate and retrain Americans for the jobs of the future. And that's like a competent sounding talking point. But then when you dig into the numbers, which I did in my book, and I was very like deeply interested, I was like, how well do government retraining programs actually work? Would you all like to guess how well they work on a percentage basis? 3%, 2%, 5%. Yeah, the range is between 0 and 15%. And fewer than 10% of workers qualify for retraining programs as they're currently structured. So you're literally looking at a solution that might work for like 1 to 2% of workers. And so it's a competent sounding talking point, but it's more or less a complete fantasy. And so the way that you try and put more economic agency and power into people's hands is really just by directly putting cash in their hands. And so the centerpiece of my platform is universal basic income, which I have rechristened the freedom dividend, because Americans just really like the word freedom. It just tests so much better with people. Actually, I take that back. Among progressives, it all tested well. But then conservatives like hate it. Then you have freedom dividend, like it. So being practical, freedom dividend it was. So if you put $1,000 a month into Americans' hands, from the data, you'd see better health and nutrition, higher graduation rates, better mental health, lower domestic violence, lower hospital visits. So you'd make life significantly better for many, many Americans very quickly. And in terms of the economic opportunities, it would create about 4 million new U.S. jobs. Because right now in a main street in the U.S. and Missouri or whatnot, if 57% of people can't afford an unexpected bill, then there's not a whole lot of excess money floating around in that community. So if you put $1,000 into their hands, they're going to spend it on things like car repairs and tutoring for their kid and the occasional night out. And all that money is going to go into the main street businesses. They're going to end up hiring people. And they're going to hire people in a way that's accessible to the people in that community.
So would you say that it empowers entrepreneurial spirit?
Yeah, it would be the greatest catalyst to entrepreneurship and creativity we've ever seen because, and this is something we all know, most entrepreneurs have a mindset of abundance, of possibility, of optimism. It's like, okay, if I do this, I can make this work and I can get that. And that's the opposite of the mindset of scarcity that most Americans are right now occupying. So in my book, I talk about how there's scarcity research, where if you were to remind someone about bills they can't pay, their functional IQ goes down by 13 points. And that's one standard deviation. So if it feels like America's getting dumber, more impulsive, less rational, more racist and misogynist, that's what is happening by the numbers, where if you introduce financial insecurity into many, many people, then that's what happens to them. So the only way to reverse that is by something like the freedom dividend, which will invert that. Right now, in my view, scarcity is winning in this country about 60-40. And so we can make abundance win by 60-40 with something like the freedom dividend.
It's almost like ruling with fear instead of love. Ruling with love instead of fear.
Yeah, and you get their heads up to think about what they can actually do in their communities. Because there's so many people. I mean, I've worked with hundreds, thousands of entrepreneurs, as has Ron John, as has David. And entrepreneurs are so can-do and like positive. And if you go around much of the country, like I'm a Northeastern product, and I was shocked at how negative and depressed and beleaguered most of the country feels and most of the people feel. When I'll use Detroit as an example, I'm heading there next week. I love Detroit, but Detroit was a city of 1.7 million people that now has a population of 680,000. So you look around and that city is 2/3 empty, and there's no escaping that reality. I mean, there are whole neighborhoods and swaths of the town where it just seems like a bombed out science fiction landscape. And so, expecting people in that community to necessarily have like a mindset of abundance, like, it's not realistic.
So with this, the freedom dividend, you've spoken about Alaska, right?
Yes.
So for anyone who doesn't know, Alaska has implemented a similar program, and it's been fairly successful, right?
Yeah. So 36 years ago, a Republican governor said, hey, there's a lot of oil in the ground here in Alaska, and who would you rather get the oil money? The government who's just going to screw it up, or you, the Alaskan people? So then the Alaskans were like, us. And he was like, I thought you'd say that. and so now if you move to Alaska, even if you move to Alaska, the following year you would get between $1,000 and $2,000, no questions asked. And if you have young kids, they get it too. So now the petroleum dividend is wildly popular in a deep red state. And it's been in effect for 36 years. It's created thousands of jobs, it's improved children's health, it's lowered income inequality, and it's wildly popular among a bunch of very Republican Alaskans. And so anyone who thinks that it's not possible, it's like, well, they've been doing it very successfully. And one question I ask people in Iowa and New Hampshire when I'm traveling is I say, look, Alaska's doing it with oil. What is the oil of the 21st century? I'm going to ask you all the same question. What is the oil of the 21st century? Information,
Knowledge.
AI, knowledge, data. Yes. And so that is what we need to do nationwide. And that message is very, very powerful in a lot of the country.
Do you think that's contributing to what you call the greatest technological shift in history?
Well, I mean, other people are people here in this room are part of the greatest technological and economic shift in human history, in the history of the world. There are other people in other parts of the country that are just on the receiving end, honestly. It's sure they have miraculous smartphones and some great apps, but for the most part, they're on the receiving end of it. And that's one of the things that frustrates me so much is that we keep pretending that things are more or less like they were in the late 20th century when David's shaking his head at me like it's crazy. Where I tell people, it's it frustrates me when someone calls me a futurist because I'm like, this is I'm a fucking presentist. It's just that our politicians are, no offense to anyone, but just really behind the times. They remember the 50s. So it's and Washington D.C. I don't know how much time you all have spent there, but Washington D.C. just feels really, really retrograde in 20th century. I'm friendly with a lot of these legislators, and even a congressman went in there and said, this place feels like ancient Rome, where you feel like you can't get anything done, and it's got the giant marble columns and everything. This and that. If I become president in 2021, one thing I want to do is just to transform the physical environment of this place. You know what I mean? We have this dysfunctional Congress. You got to create a bullpen and force people to sit and talk to each other, force people into different interactions. And it'll take a while to build those buildings, so I probably won't benefit from the upgrades.
How do we work?
Yes, a giant congressional WeWork. Let's bring it in. Because even if you go in trying to make changes, the buildings are so old and it's all old wood and it's da-da-da. They should just put it's almost like they're wearing wigs or something. It's standing around. So you have to upgrade that stuff.
I'm laughing because I actually went to school in DC and know exactly what you're talking about. It does feel like you're walking around like an old mausoleum, right? And there are ways that you can change that, and make it more lively. And one thing that does have the benefit of is it's mostly young people that live in that city, which is kind of sad in its own way because that means the politicians don't live there.
Oh.
But it is mostly young people, and I think when you're president, people will really take to those changes.
Well, thank you. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
So, So we'd be remiss to not ask you about the blockchain here in Silicon Valley. Do you have any
I
thoughts?
was like, I'm
or
talking about it
relationships?
here. I gotta say, like, there's no
We all know
blockchain
it. Here we
passing
all
these
know
lips in Iowa. I'm not like busting out the blockchain there. So, all right. So big picture, the market, and this is one reason again why Anita and I are super aligned. So the market does not recognize many things that are core to the human experience. And I'm a parent. How many of y'all are parents? Raise your hands. Your kids. So I've got 2 boys, 6 and 3, one of whom is autistic, and there are many things that the market does not care about, including child rearing and nurturing, caregiving, volunteering in the community, the environment to a large extent, arts and creativity very often, increasingly journalism in a lot of towns around the country. Journalism has like 0 market reward. And so right now a lot of these things are losing in American life, and we're spending less time on them. Americans even socialize like at least 25% less than they did in earlier days. And so right now, if we just keep following the market, we're going to end up zeroing out many of these activities over time progressively. And so the goal to me is that we modernize our measurement of economic growth, where GDP is something we invented almost 100 years ago during the Great Depression when things were going to shit, and the government was like we need a number for this. And then so this guy, Simon Kuznets, came up with GDP, and he said at the time 3 things. 1, we should never use this as a measurement for national well-being because it's really bad for that. Number 2, we should include parenthood and motherhood because they add immense value. Then number 3, we should not include national defense spending because it actually has no economic value. So of course we ignored all those things. And I'm like GDP. And so now, almost 100 years later, we need to upgrade our visions of economic growth to include human-centered measurements. So you all are brilliant people who are making the future happen. So how would you all measure the economy if you had to just do so from scratch today? Like there's none of this GDP thing, and you're just like, hey,
Happiness quotient, like Bhutan.
yes,
That's
happiness, quality adjusted life expectancy. And if you did that, you'd see our life expectancy has declined for the last 2 years, which is shocking in a developed country. Mental health, freedom from substance abuse. And if we did that, we'd see 8 Americans are dying of drugs every hour, also shocking.
Do you think that's an indicator of something larger in the society?
Oh, very much so. I mean, you go out to these places. So when you get rid of a factory, and I've spent 7 years now working in the Midwest and the South, when you get rid of factories, those communities go dark red very quickly. Like they become very conservative. And right now they're doing a lot of drugs. I mean, that's there's like a lot of darkness. There's a plague. So if we were to upgrade the measurements of economic growth to be things like childhood success rates or environmental sustainability, then you end up creating a whole new range of activities that people could do. So maybe right now, there are 3.5 million truck drivers in this country. It's the most common job in 29 states. 94% male, average age 49. I mean, reflect on that population. I mean, what you visualize as a truck driver, that's pretty much a truck driver. That's true. It's not like, Andrew, that's like a stereotype. No, it's 94%. And so then the question is, if here in Silicon Valley, the people are confident that we're going to automate away a significant proportion of those 3.5 million jobs, because there's 168 billion in economic rewards per year for automating freight, then you have to imagine what will the new activities be for that population. And right now the market will say like, well, the market's like, we don't really have much need for like a former truck driver, like went back in our community. But if you create an economy where if that person helps their neighbor, it's your favorite, right? Helps the neighbor, gives someone a ride, like coaches a little bit, move some things around, maybe like install some solar panels, like any of these things, then it doesn't need to be a 9 to 5, but they can add enough value where they end up having meaningful engagement with the economy. So we need to evolve to the next stage of capitalism. And we have to stop following GDP and capital efficiency off a cliff because more and more Americans will have less and less of a place in that in our current economy.
So would you say these markers like GDP and declining, I think the employment rate, or not the employment rate, but the rate of
labor force
participation declined by 3 or 4%.
Yeah, which is enormous. I mean, you talk about like each percentage point leaving the labor force is like 2.5 million adults dropping out. So right now, as we're here together, the labor force participation rate in the United States is 62.9%, which is a multi-decade low, much, much lower than other industrialized countries, and the same level as El Salvador and the Dominican Republic. That's right now in year 10 of an expansion, where things ought to be going well. So you have already this massive unskilled men getting pushed out of the workforce. And men and women deal with idleness differently. Women, you deal with idleness just fine, turns out. It's like you find very wholesome, positive things to do, and like the home, community, like caregiving, right to school, it's all good. Men, we deal with idleness terribly. Is there like a guy here who wants to volunteer what idle man?
Candy
That's so to David's point, 75% of free time spent on the computer. Unemployed men volunteer less than employed men, even though they have much more time. And then they move into drinking a lot, substance abuse, self-destructive behaviors, and a general downward spiral. And that's almost universal for men. And so that drives the opiate deaths that we're talking about earlier. So it's all tied together. And we're looking at like a nation scale, society-wide set of problems. And the solutions that politicians are suggesting are just going to nibble around the edges. And so we have to go much, much deeper. We have to attack the reasons why Donald Trump won the election. And he's a symptom, but he's not the cause of the disease. Like, people who are focusing on him, to me, are missing the point. It's like all of these other things drove Americans to a point where he became president.
And how will the freedom dividend cure that disease?
So the freedom dividend alone will not cure the disease, though it will do a whole lot of good, like a whole lot of good. And if you think about and I'm going to go a little bit into the campaign, where Donald Trump's set of solutions was essentially, we're going to freeze time, we're going to turn the clock back, like build a wall, hate immigrants, like generally just like really berserk, ridiculous nonsense. And so then the other direction is like turn the clock forward, accelerate time and society, like value people intrinsically. $1,000 a month would be transformative for tens of millions of families around the U.S. And then if we were to layer other things on top of it, there are three things that are making Americans miserable in terms of their costs. Number one is housing, which you can all relate to here. Here, though it's worse here than it is in other parts of the country. It's not as crazy here. Number two is healthcare. And then number three is education. And those three things have had massive inflationary pressures over the last number of years because those markets are completely distorted and dysfunctional. And so we have to go and try and attack each of those pain points and say, look, why is our healthcare system so expensive? Why are we spending twice as much as other countries do, even though we get worse results? It's like, well, let's do something about that. So I'm for single-payer healthcare, government negotiate the prices much, much lower, and then there'd be a parallel gold-plated system for people who work at the NVIDIAs of the world or whatnot. And so that would be, to me, like an intelligent way to alleviate a lot of what's driving Americans to distraction. Why is college so ridiculously expensive? Like, it's gotten 2.5 times more expensive, and no offense to Ranjan, who's a professor in excellence, and I'm sure delivers immense value every time he steps in that lecture hall. But it's not like college has gotten 2.5 times better since, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like, oh, it's 2.5 times more expensive because it's just 2.5 times more edifying. So you have to look at like why those costs have skyrocketed and then try and get those costs down. And, you're going to have to hold colleges accountable for it and say, look, guys, like, charging, how much is Stanford nowadays, Jackson?
It's a lot.
50. Yeah, so, I mean, the thing is, Stanford, they can charge what they want. But there are a lot of other schools where you look at it and be like, should that school really be that much? And so right now we've overprescribed college generally in this society. and we've stigmatized vocational and apprenticeship and technical work when those jobs are actually some of the hardest to automate. You know, it's like you're going to have a really hard time automating an air conditioning repair person.
Yeah.
There's not going to be like the aircon robot being like, hey, I'm like, you're like, you know, I mean, that's really hard. I'm looking at Raja too, because that air conditioning system was built in like a long time ago. So the robot's like, you know, I mean, sure, you can make a modern one now, but so we need to destigmatize that entire set of opportunities because there are 15 million unfilled middle skill jobs right now in the U.S. And then on the flip side, we have 1.5 trillion in college and grad school debt with all these young people getting degrees that don't make any sense. So we need to try and drive more people towards the vast middle and transform the culture really to prioritize and value that sort of work. Because right now, kids think if I don't go to college, I'm a loser. And then so they think they have to go to college. And that's not right.
You know, it's interesting that you bring that up because there's the numbers show that fewer and fewer people are going to universities and colleges, but more people are enrolling in these vocational schools. And if we have that stigma, you know, that creates, you know, a cohort of people that have this, you know, bias, you know, maybe I should have gone to college, when it doesn't need to be that way. So it's interesting. I'm curious, what do you think for your children? Will they be in four-year universities? Will they be paying for
my dream for my children is that they get into Stanford and then drop out after 1 year. That is the height.
Yes. So you don't have to pay.
Yes. I've only budgeted for 1 year of tuition. After that, you're on your own, son.
But truthfully though, I mean, you know, as technology progresses and whatnot, do you think education will change? Do you think, you know, the freedom dividend would change the way that we go about educating our young people?
Well, I think the freedom dividend would make it much, much more attractive for many people to not necessarily attend college, truthfully, because like if you could maybe pool your money with like a few friends and like start a small business or whatnot, that would become much, much more realistic for many, many Americans. And that's what we should be doing in a lot of these small towns around the country, because a lot of these small towns too are emptying out. And there's so many trends that horrified me when I wrote this book. If you read the book, how many of you read the book? I mean, a bunch of you have. So if you read the book, you're like, wow, there's a lot of really depressing shit in this book. And you should know that was the experience I had writing it. I was like, oh man, that number is crazy. Like, there's so many crazy numbers in this book. You're like, that can't be right. And you're like, it's like, so some of the numbers that horrified me, 40% of American children today born to an unmarried mother, which I found shocking. Americans move across state lines at lower levels than they have in decades. Americans start businesses at lower levels than they have in decades, where there's one stat that I don't think made it into the book where literally 80% of the new businesses in the U.S. are started in one of 20 counties. Not 20% of counties, 20 counties. It's like that dynamism is that concentrated in a small set of areas. And that's the way it felt when I went to a lot of these other parts of the country, where you go to other parts of the country and there are a lot of businesses closing and not a whole lot of businesses opening.
So how will you convey to these, you know, maybe it's truck drivers in Illinois, how will you convey that this is the truth, because they're not really seeing it firsthand? You know, they don't have Silicon Valley.
Well, you know, what's interesting, guys, so I've now been to Iowa 5 times, New Hampshire 4 times. And so when I go, and there's a video of me speaking to 1,000 Iowans online right now that, you know, gives you a sense of it. And what I say to them is like, hey, have you noticed stores closing in your main streets, in your areas? And they all say yes. And then I ask them, why do you think that is? And then they all say Amazon, which is right. And then I say, yes, is that going to get worse or better? And they were like, worse. So they know it. There's no like mystery. And then I say, well, what are you going to do about it? And then they say, well, what can we do about it? And I say, I tell you what you can do about it. You can make me president, and I will bring each of you $1,000 instead of it all just getting whisked off to Seattle, and then you could rebuild your Main Street economy. I would bring $16 billion a year here to the people of Iowa, would create 40,000 jobs here in Iowa. Like, let's do something about it. And that message is very, very powerful. And it's working. Where I'm going to break down some of the mechanics of the election. It's so fun. So we have this very, very messed up political system in this country, as most of you know. And most of the arteries, the pipes are clogged with money. Like when you get there and it's like, it's all just institutionalized. But then like a good science fiction movie, there's like a porthole to like a vulnerability where you like climb through the porthole and then you wind up in Iowa. No, it's true. And then you wind up in these little like union halls and homes and cornfields, and there are 3.1 million people in Iowa. What percentage of them do you think participated in the Democratic caucus in 2016? What percent?
4%.
For half.
2.9.
But between 5 and 6%. And the reason for that is that caucusing in Iowa is a multi-hour commitment. It's not like, oh, like a little booth, like pull a booth and like get out of there. You stand there and you have to publicly say, I'm supporting Andrew Yang. And then you argue with your neighbors, you stand in different parts of the room, and then if your candidate's not viable, you get like reassigned, being like, hey, your candidate doesn't have enough people, so pick a new candidate. And then they reorganize and they debate after every reorganization, and the whole thing takes a couple of hours. It's also dead winter in Iowa. And Iowa, it turns out, is right next to Minnesota. It's actually quite cold. So 170,000 Iowans participated in 2016 in this process. So let's say this cycle, a lot of enthusiasm, it goes up to 200,000. Now, most of you know that the Democratic field is going to be very, very crowded this time. Let's call it 20 candidates. So how many of the 200,000 Iowans do I need to win in order to win Iowa?
5.001%.
Oh, really? It might be that low, but like we're estimating, if I were to win 20%, I win Iowa easily. Like you might win with like 15%. So you're looking at winning literally 30,000 Iowans. And then that would be enough to make me like number 1, 2, or 3 in Iowa, and would make me like national headlines, like all this momentum. And I'm telling you, I've been there 5 times, and I can get 30 to 40,000 Iowans to own this reality. Like I don't, yeah. Like you don't need 60% of them. You don't need 1 million of them. You just need 30 to 40,000. And I can get that. This is like a good science fiction movie where you like find the lever. the lever is just this 30 to 40,000 Iowans. And you can see me speaking to a bunch of them online. You see, like I just talk sense. And it works on enough of them where I can win.
I want to add something for you. Edgar and I are talking about doing loan forgiveness, student loan forgiveness, and of course elder care, because those are his 2 passionate subjects. But with our time banking, with Save Exchange, we're working with SoFi, the loan forgiveness. There's a lot of things we're adding, so you can add more things to it. So when he asked about, UBI and college, no. UBI is not going to pay for your college, but time banking will. Mm-hmm. We're going to do that. So I have a whole bunch more. I'll write to you, and you can
please.
more of these things out to them, and they'll like it. This is going to be exciting.
Yeah.
You're going to win.
Aneeth is in his cabinet already.
Yeah, come on. Anyone who wants to join me in Iowa, I'll be back there November 16th. So if anyone wants to come to Iowa City, it's a delightful college town. You can come on out. Did you just raise your hand? You want to come to Iowa? Was that what It's not as cool now as it's going to be. All right, let's go to questions. Ava.
What's your plan for climate change?
Yes. So one of my fondest hopes is that if you imagine in America where people are getting $1,000 a month, that it will encourage many more communal living arrangements where people will come together and say, hey, the 5 of us get together, we can like fix up that old farmhouse and then live together. I think it will fuel a real movement towards minimalism personally, because there are going to be many more Americans who want to live simply in a way that doesn't like cost them a lot of money. Like there are a lot of people I know who feel stuck in New York who might like be like, hey, I'm now actually kind of excited to go to Vermont or someplace cheaper. But I do think climate change is an existential threat to our society on the same scale as the automation of jobs. To me, the automation of jobs is coming quicker and nastier but not by much because climate change is like right there behind it. And so one of my big hopes at this point, unfortunately, I'm very negative on this, the sense that like even if we were to be very aggressive about our own carbon emissions, the U.S. is less than 20% of global emissions, and at this point, we're probably at a point where the Earth's going to warm, the sea levels are going to rise, even if we were to get more aggressive about our own emissions. So I would certainly resubscribe to the Paris Accords, but I would get much more aggressive and invest in geoengineering and mitigation and resilience. So to me, we should be investing hundreds of billions of dollars on our infrastructure, trying to make it more resilient. We should restrict any insurance from building in places that are hurricane prone and flood prone that we know are just going to have problems over the years. And we should invest billions and billions on doing things like, apparently the way glaciers melt is that warm water hits their base and then they melt over time. So if you were to pile up a bunch of dirt at the base of that glacier, you might be able to preserve that glacier for an extra series of decades. And so we have to start piling some dirt at the bases of glaciers. I'm even for various mechanical solutions. Like, this is going to sound very science fiction-y and dumb, but I'm for mirrored satellites where you just like mount them up and then it's like kind of the little Mr. Burns style. But as long as it's mechanical, you can undo it. You don't like it, you'd be like, hey, let's take that thing down. Take that thing down. Like, put it up on an, in like an elevator. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
And even things that are as simple as recycling, there's a direct correlation with the amount that people recycle and the median salary in a location.
So you're saying that if we got more people money into people's hands, because one of my concerns, if you put more money into people's hands, that they might like consume more and have a higher like carbon footprint. But I think that would be somewhat balanced out in some ways. But like, we need to go very aggressively towards this. And one way, if you were to measure economic progress and include sustainability as part of the measurement, then you might be able to get millions of Americans doing things like installing solar panels and recycling.
How about putting a price on carbon to fund your basic income?
Yes, I'm all for it. I should have included that. Thank you. I'm all for a carbon tax and dividend. One of my favorite things in the world is trying to get companies to internalize the cost of what they're doing. So I think we should fine gun manufacturers for any gun death that's caused, and then that would motivate them to say, hey, you know what? Maybe I should like try and not have guns get into the hands of people that are going to use them to kill people. They'd also invest in things like signature guns and technologies that would like make it so that they're less dangerous. I love internalizing costs because I was an econ guy, and like if a company is going to benefit itself from a negative externality that affects the rest of us, then that ends up fueling really perverse corporate behaviors. So we have to bring that money back, and the carbon dividend, tax and dividends are a great way to do that.
We're charging $1 million per bullet.
Yeah, I mean, if you charge $1 million per death, I mean, that would be a game changer. And that's my starting point, is like, if your gun kills someone like in a public setting, then you get charged $1 million.
This channel has a question.
Drew.
Yeah, one of the results of having Trump as a president is that the racist underbelly of the United States has been unmasked. You earlier called yourself the magical agent, but to much of America, you are the scary agent. How are you going to deal with that?
You know what's been interesting for me is Iowa's about 94% white. New Hampshire is 92. It's pretty similar. And if you're in an environment that's that predominantly white, the level of racial animus or hostility is very, very low because they don't actually have any like insecurities about it. And part of it is that I do not need to convince everyone in those states. I just need to convince the Democrats. And the level of racial hostility I've gotten from the Democrats in those places has been essentially zero. Now, if I get to a point where I become the nominee, then it becomes much, much hairier. But I will say that I'm already getting a bunch of Trump voters supporting my campaign. And they'll say things to me personally. They'll say, I supported Donald Trump. I'll support you too. And the things they like about me are that I'm an outsider. I'm trying to shake things up. Like I don't seem I'm like a crony. And the fact that I want to give everyone money makes me seem really like anti-institutional in a way that a lot of Trump supporters really, really like. So political alignment in the U.S. is like a horseshoe where the ends start touching each other again. So there are a lot of Americans who really liked Bernie and Trump, as an example. And I'm falling into the same camp where there are people on the extremes that like me, and that includes a lot of Trump voters.
Yeah, I think that's because you are you are actually a human. You know, right? Like, although we're talking about automation, so who knows? But I mean, in all honesty, though, like,
how do you know? No.
Andrew, how are you going to fund the freedom dividend?
So the main way to fund it, so that you guys will appreciate this. So the trap we're in right now is that the big winners from AI and new technologies are going to be the biggest tech companies who are great at avoiding taxes. No offense to anyone.
Yes, Apple.
So Amazon's thing is like, we didn't make any money this quarter. Like, no, I can tell you. Alphabet's thing is it all went through Ireland. Like, nothing to see here. And so the problem is that these innovations are going to soak up more and more work, and the public's not going to see very much of it. So what we need to do as a country is we need to join every other industrialized economy and have a value-added tax, which would then give the public a tiny slice of every Google search and Amazon transaction. And because our economy now is so massive, it's up to $19 trillion, up $4 trillion in the last 10 years, a value-added tax at even half the European level would generate almost $1 trillion in new revenue. And then that money would end up going back into the tech companies anyway, eventually, and like everyone else, because putting money into Americans' hands would grow the consumer economy by about 12%. Then we get back $500 billion of that in new taxes and revenue, and we'd spend much less on things like healthcare, incarceration, homelessness services that we spend about $1 trillion on, and we could get back about 600 of the 800 billion we currently spend on welfare programs. So those things together would be enough to fund the freedom dividend. A lot is we have 126 welfare programs right now, and we could clean up a lot of that, because a lot of those programs, unfortunately, have really perverse incentives tied in where if you start to flourish, then you get less. And the darkest version of that is disability, where literally you're afraid to volunteer because if someone identifies you as healthy, then you don't get your disability payments anymore. So right now, the rate at which Americans get off of long-term disability is literally 0%. No one ever just wakes up and says, I feel better today. I'm going to go to work. No, I don't need this anymore. Like 0%. And so if you were to go to those people, and there are millions of them now, there are more Americans now on disability than work in construction. Because of the manufacturing workers, the 4 million manufacturing workers that lost their jobs in the Midwest, half of them left the workforce, never to be heard from again. And of the half that left the workforce, half of them filed for disability. And so right now there are millions of Americans on disability. And how many of them would actually feel better if you said, hey, you're going to get the money regardless? Probably a lot of them, unfortunately.
So what's the response? So some comments might say, well, the prices will just increase to reflect the $1,000 that's been given to each person. So net they're the same. So what's the official response to that?
So I commented earlier that the real causes of inflation in the U.S. have been in housing, education, or healthcare. If you look at consumer goods, prices have actually been fairly not inflationary around things like media for sure, food, electronics, cars. They're either getting a lot better and staying the same price. And so if you put $1,000 into Americans' hands, they'd still be very, very price sensitive and budget conscious. And there'd still be a lot of competition between firms. So unless you have like a quasi-monopoly in a place, one of the examples I use is like, let's say I give everyone in a town in Missouri $1,000 extra a month, which I want to do. And then some burger joint's like, ooh, I'm going to like raise the price of my burgers from like $5 to like $8 because everyone has $1,000 more. And the person's still going to go in and be like, wait, why's your burger $8? And then as long as there's another burger joint somewhere in town, then someone will be like, I'm going to go to that one. And so there'll still be competition between firms. Like you're not going to be able to capture all that money.
What's interesting also about that is American. So I also studied econ, right? So like the U.S. dollar it's a power currency, right? So if you were just to give $12,000 a year to people, if all the goods were increased in price in America, it would splay out throughout the whole entire world, right? And that's just not, that's not a realistic concept.
We're living in a moment of infinite quantitative easing, because certain people don't want to lose in the upcoming elections.
Interesting. Quantitative easing. That's an econ term that we won't go into.
Good question.
Oh yeah, sure thing.
Okay, if you put the money in people's hands, let them do the work, and whatever they try to do, it will be probably like still like old economy. But I feel that you have good vision for new economy. How do you like guide people into the new economy with those money?
Yes. So, one of the things that you all very, very instinctively get is that I love progress, I love innovation, and the rest of it. It's just we need to have bridges forward for many, many people. And I agree with you that many people, you put $1,000 in their hands, that it would be going into businesses that are not meant to be like competitive with the Amazons of the world. So the stat I cited earlier about how Americans aren't moving very much is that the hope is that you could spur increased mobility, where if you live in a small town in Missouri and you're getting this $1,000, then like maybe moving to St. Louis or Kansas City becomes more appealing, and then you end up participating more in the global economy. That a lot of these small towns and truck stops, frankly, won't have any economic reason to exist, and the hope is that you can get a lot of people to move and leave. But it's difficult in America to say like, hey, it's time to, we're gonna like just have you all move. So the hope is that the freedom dividend would enable mobility out of a lot of these communities for many, many people. Because right now, most of them don't have the financial wherewithal to move, and to the extent they have any assets, it's a house that they're underwater on.
I would think that just like Donald Trump like lecture everywhere, and you infuse those dreams to those people, and they will follow the vision.
Yes, yeah, it's like the vision of the human-centered economy and the trickle-up economy. We have a different vision, hopefully, that people will get excited about. Ramin, since you hosted, you deserve a question, brother.
Just one question. I mean, I just, well, thank you for your sincerity and your integrity. You've never said anything online or in person where I thought you were full of shit, tampering, and I've never been able to say that about anyone running for political office. I mean, I'm talking like city council. So thank you for that, and thank you for making this choice. And that's really my deepest curiosity is, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this for us, for yourself? Why are you doing this?
Thanks, Ramin. It means a lot coming from you. I had an incredible journey starting Venture for America over the last 7 years. And much of it was invigorating, inspiring. On the flip side, much of it was really terrifying, where you would be in the rooms with, like, I met, 3 of the last 4 presidents and like a lot of the senators and a lot of the governors. And I was like, wow, like, these people are not that awesome for the most part. And then it's like, wow, it's like, if these are the people in charge, like, this is not great. It's not a great scene. And then when I began to feel so strongly about like the threats that we're facing from really just an economic transformation that our society is not able to get its arms around. And I've been around enough to know, again, like no one else is going to do anything about it, that I thought to myself, and this has been wrong before, but it's like if I were to bust my ass and put everything I had in the line and just, like strain my family and put everything I had into it, like, do I have a chance to meaningfully address the greatest problems of this age, to alleviate poverty, to build a more humane and human-centered economy? It's like, yeah, I think I have that chance. Like, it's not, like an 80% chance, but it's a chance. And it's certainly a chance to accelerate the timeline as the downside. Like, I now know I could be the president in 2021. Like, I've seen the path. But if I don't become president, like, will I meaningfully push society forward? And it felt like, yes, I would. And then when you feel that, then you really feel like an obligation to put your heart and soul into it. Because if you don't at that point, then you're kind of an asshole.
Andrew, can you talk a little bit more about gun law? I just came back from Pittsburgh. I was blocks away from the synagogue. and how, you know, you were talking about internalizing the cost. I feel already there are so many guns in American
US, yeah.
hands. How do we provide, you know, to make America safer?
Yes. So there are 300 million guns in the U.S., give or take, almost one for every man, woman, and child. So we're the most heavily armed society in the history of the world. Now, a lot of those guns are like, it's not like everyone has one gun. It's like a lot of it's like I've got 80 guns. so there's, you know, some spikiness in the ownership. But it's very, very difficult to meaningfully reduce that supply of firearms. Now, I'm pro gun control. I've got like a series of policies that I believe we need to adopt that I think would help a lot. Like raise the age of ownership to 21 to try and keep it out of teenagers' hands. Again, like fine gun manufacturers, which would be very hard to get through, but if you did it, I think it would be transformative. Invest in technology where, like, I would upgrade anyone's gun to a signature gun if they, like, just for free, because it just make us all safer. But I believe if we were to do everything that I'm suggesting, do it right, mental health. My brother's a psychology professor, and like it's all tied together. I mean, we have a mental health crisis in this country, and that's going to drive a lot of violent behavior. But bigger picture than that, the U.S. is heading towards being majority minority in 2045, which is 27 years from now. And there are very, very few examples in recorded history of a dominant ethnic group voluntarily relinquishing or sharing its power over time. Like, we've had this sort of happy thought. It's like, oh, majority minority will be great. The more likely scenario is a lot of racially charged conflict, strife, and violence over the next 27 years. And a lot of that will be driven by like people who like guns a lot and have guns. And so I spoke to a group of Asian Americans at Harvard last weekend, and I said, and this was the day of the shooting, and I said, we're one generation away from that happening to Asian Americans, like in my mind, where like Jews, in like most historically visible target, and anti-Semitic violence, in my opinion, will, like I think there was one stat where anti-Semitic incidents went up 60% just in this last year or so. And so we're facing like a very, very difficult set of issues with guns and violence over this next period of time. And we have no choice but to own it, be honest about it, confront it, and try and, like one thing I also want is I just want to buy guns back, no questions asked, be like, well, just pay market value and just spend billions trying to...
That's what Australia did, right?
Yeah, that's what Australia did. Like, I think we need to go after it very hard. And there is a chance that we can break through, because right now there's a relative, like, it's not like the majority of Americans are fervent, like NRA, like gun enthusiasts. It's a relatively small percentage. It's just that they're very, very energized, very, very passionate, and there's a lot of money backing them. But that's what we have to try and unlock and break. And one of the goals to me is to try and make them feel privileged. Well, I'm very, very goal oriented. It's like I'm not ideological at all. So like one of my hopes is to be like, you own a gun, that's great. Like, you know, we need to make it so that you're like the elite. We have to make it so that someone else owning a gun is like really tough. Like, you know, you like are badass. You have like a signature gun that only you can fire, and you're like James Bond, like just go in and be like, you know, we're like grandfather you in. We're gonna give you all these privileges. These other losers, they're not like you. They don't deserve a gun. That's the hope. We'll see if I can pull it off. But
the gun lobbies, though, that's the problem. It's the politicians. The gun lobbies own the politicians. That's why these laws aren't changed, even if the people want to change them.
Yeah, so I had this conversation just yesterday with this guy who was part of the tobacco settlements, and he said to me that tobacco looked a lot like firearms now. It's like no one could touch them, and they had a stranglehold on Congress and the rest of it, and then it turned, and he told me that it turned because of some attorney generals in like really not like the glamour states, like an attorney general in like Mississippi like decided to like go after tobacco, and then it like started this wave. So it is possible. It seems impossible now, but it is possible. And he said he sees the same trends building towards firearms.
What's interesting too is, you know, you've talked about how you get to, you know, go about this with a different playbook, so to speak, right? Not being the traditional politician. And do you think that will play into your favor, tackling these different issues from an alternative perspective?
I really do, because if you look at the numbers right now, about 28% of Americans identify as Democrats, 23% as Republicans, and 44% as independents, which is probably a lot of you in this room. So there's this huge hunger for a third perspective. And someone called me the shuffler, because a lot of what I'm talking about, a lot of independents and conservatives would like, including universal basic income, which has a very deep libertarian heritage. And if you talk to conservatives and libertarians, what they hate is the government making decisions. What they like is individual autonomy and agency. So they like the freedom dividend. But right now, the problem is that the extremities are controlling the political conversation because of the bipolarity of the party system. So the hope is that I can reshuffle. Right now I'm running as a Democrat, you guys didn't know, but I'm running as a Democrat. Hopefully we can drag the Democratic Party in a particular direction and empower the middle, empower the independent silent majority.
It's reminiscent of, so one of the Silicon Valley acolytes is, Buckminster Fuller, and he talks about, he has this great quote where he's like, you don't bring in change by fighting reality, you bring in change by creating a new model that renders the rest of it obsolete. And that's the kind of changes that you're putting forth.
That's what I'm going for. Thank you, Jeremy. That's all I want.
So with the coming automation, what would be the policy implications for immigration, and how would you explain that to a Trump supporter, and how would you explain that to a Bernie supporter?
It would surprise no one here to hear that I'm very pro-immigrant. My parents immigrated here, and I know like half the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs or other immigrants are sons and daughters of immigrants. So I think that we should be competing for talent at the high end. I think if you come to this country and study at a college, that we should staple a green card to your diploma. How many of you know an awesome person who had to fight to stay in this country, or even got kicked out of this country? Because we all know those people. And it's so ridiculous, where it would take you literally 1 second to be like, oh man, this person would be great, as an American, and they are forced to leave. It's irrational economically too, because it's draining your competition. On the other side, we need to enforce the borders very, very rigorously, and not I'm very pro borders. So my plan would be a path to citizenship for people who are here illegally into the formal economy, but it would be an 18-year path. So to keep the incentives to immigrate here illegally very low, and make it so that if you can pay taxes and stay on the good side of the law in society for 18 years, that's long enough for me. Sounds like maybe one more question. Sure.
So we're living in a really weird world when a lot of Trump supporters don't actually believe him. A majority of them say that they wish he would tweet less. A lot of them say they have a lot of problems with him, but they support him anyway for a variety of reasons. I think recently there's been something going around about whether it's, some people think of politics as conflict, and some people think of it as just fixing mistakes. And there's, the mistake people. I think we're a lot of mistake people here. We're just thinking about policy and how we're going to fix things and how we're going to make things better. But if you do get to a point where you're going to have to fight Trump, you're going to have to be dealing with a lot of crazy. So Tony Blair used to say that he was going to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. I think you've told us really well how you're going to be tough on the causes of Trump. How are you going to be tough on Trump?
Wow. So a guy in Iowa, after hearing me speak, came up to me afterwards and said, I would love to have you debate Donald Trump one-on-one because you would destroy him. And so the goal is not to out-Trump Trump, for sure. I mean, I am sort of the anti-Trump in the sense that I'm the cerebral Asian guy. But if I'm talking directly to the causes of people's pain and talk about ways you can elevate their day-to-day, I think that's going to be enough for me to win at least a critical mass of the people that currently support Donald Trump. And so one fun thing about running for president is you're yourself sort of accentuated or enhanced. But certainly me trying to be someone I'm not would not work very well. And so I think I can beat Trump on the merits because you go into it with, let's say 45% of the population that's like very, very anti-Trump, and then you just need to win that slice in the middle, which I'm very, very confident I could do. And that guy in Iowa gave me that confidence. So for those of you who want to become a part of the campaign, we would love to have you. So I just want to shout out to Ranjan, David, Brian, and other people who have maxed out to the campaign or come close to doing so. And the maximum is only $2,700 directly to the campaign. I mean, it's like, you know, so affordable for so many of you. So if you would like to join them in that, my staffer Matt, where are you at, Matt? Is over there. And if you donate tonight, we will give you a signed copy of my book. We have a stash in the back. Now you don't need to You don't need to max out. If you donate anything, we'll give you a book until we run out. But I just want to thank Anita, Adam, Ranjan, Raman, and everyone else for bringing this all together tonight. And thank you all. So beautiful. And Jeremy for the hosting, and Jeremy for moderating. But yes, let's show our fellow citizens what's still possible. Thank you all very much.
Where do you want to sign in?
I'll sign over here in the middle.